What's up, my friend? Welcome back to another video, and today we are going to dive into orchestration specifically. And I want to share with you three orchestration techniques that have really changed my life. When I was younger, and I was listening to music before I really got into composing and arranging, I always wondered in the back of my mind, like, how are they achieving these textures and what makes them sound so beautiful? And it's really been a lifelong passion and journey for me ever since. And so in today's video, I kind of want to share those three techniques with you that have really inspired me and ones that have really changed my workflow for the better. So before we really dive into those three techniques, I want to give you a gift right off the bat, and this is my orchestration essentials guide. In case you don't have it yet, it's a totally free PDF that you can download, and it basically contains my 5-step orchestration framework to approaching every single arrangement. So it gives you a clear step-by-step workflow. It also helps you start from a general overview and then work your way into the details. And I think fundamentally we know this, but sometimes it makes more sense to look at things from the fundamental perspective first, kind of like an overview, understand why things happen, and then go into the details. So this guide will reveal those one step at a time. And then I'll also cover more of those details, going over some specific orchestration techniques that you can use for your mockups to make them sound realistic. And finally, I'll also include my favorite elements for ear candy and added interest to enhance the listening experience. So if you want to grab that totally free, you can click the first link in the description box below. And again, it's my gift to you for checking out this orchestration video today. And I really hope it helps you. It's been super valuable for my students already, so I hope it helps you as well. Okay, so let's kind of dive in. First of all, I want to be truthful with you. I always want to be honest. And I used to be scared of arranging, honestly. Because again, I told you before, when I was younger, I always asked myself, like, how can I achieve those effects? And I could just never really pinpoint it. But, I would just have no idea how to replicate the arrangement that I heard. For example, hearing Super Mario Galaxy's soundtrack, it's so cleanly recorded. All of those instruments are so beautifully shown and presented, but I just didn't know how to achieve that same effect. And to be honest, there are still quite a few genres that still stump me. So orchestral music is kind of my forte, but then there's there's poppier styles, there's like funk, there's soul, there's metal, like there's a variety of genres that I absolutely do not specialize in and I'm terrible at, but that just goes to show that there's always something that we could be learning in life. And I think it really comes down to understanding the individual components and how they can work together to create the desired result that we're going for. So in this case, we're talking specifically about orchestral music, but this again applies really to any genre we're working with. And because we're talking about the orchestra, it presents a finite ensemble. So there's basically a limited number of instruments, from the strings all the way down to the percussion. There's a finite number of instruments that we're working with, which makes it easy to dissect and uncover everything it has to offer. Whereas if you contrast that with something like sound design, there are so many possibilities there because you can tweak one sound like infinite ways, right? And you could still be dissatisfied. But with a natural sounding live orchestra, there are really only so many ways that you can arrange the instruments, if you're not trying to mangle the sound or anything like that. So that's the beauty of an orchestra. But let me give you a couple of reasons why I love the orchestra in addition to that. First of all, the amount of expressivity you can generate from the ensemble is nearly unparalleled. There's something that the orchestra gives us emotionally that just can't be replicated with other forms or other mediums of instruments, and it just really is something special. It contains a timeless quality that can evoke nostalgia and finesse. And if you watch films, if you enjoy films or if you watch video games or play video games, I should say, you probably know what I mean. Like you play these games or you watch these films and they give you that nostalgic feeling. And a large part of that is not just due to the scene itself, but part of it is just the music that's enhancing the overall experience and, really getting the medium's message across, which is really, really important. It's like half of what's needed to create the experience, the other half being the actual visual medium itself. Also, the color combinations and the overall timbres are so fulfilling. Think about the woodwind section, how many different sounds you have within that one section. And the strings, that lush sound, that homogeneous texture you get throughout the section. Just the amount of variety you get overall is just so beautiful and it all works together so well. It's also extremely versatile, right? Because you can have solo instruments and those sound beautiful on their own. They're maybe a more intimate context, or you want something more raw sounding. Whereas a full symphony orchestra fills up the space beautifully. So maybe you want to present a more energetic or passionate moment. Well, then, a full orchestra, because of all those people playing together and contributing their energies together and just creating that one beautiful sound, it just makes that entire energy just flow, and it's just so beautiful. So it's just so versatile, and there's so many things you could do with the orchestra. So let me quickly go over these three orchestration techniques with you, and then I'll dive into them one step at a time. The first one is the harmonic series. Okay, you might have heard of this before. Essentially, it allows us to create these full and resonant chords applicable to many situations, as opposed to muddy chords or ones that feel unbalanced because maybe we've arranged it incorrectly. The harmonic series is a great template to follow to create these full resonant chords. Number two is to think melodically. So rather than thinking chord by chord, I prefer to think of my orchestral parts in melodies, individual melodies that are performed one at a time and usually at once as well, to create counter melodies and just beautiful textures that flow and that move seamlessly throughout. And then number three is arranging in layers. So again, thinking from that overview perspective, what's the most important element, working your way down to the details. And this will allow us to create a very balanced orchestration with clarity in all the instruments. So knowing exactly what each instrument is doing and how to actually achieve that. So let's kind of talk about the first one, the harmonic series. Essentially, what you need to know is that you want to use wide intervals at the bottom and then use narrower intervals as we move upwards. And intervals are just the spacing between different notes, right? So for example, the lower we go, the more we're going to use things like octaves or 12s or 15s if you want double octaves. But these wider octaves will give the ensemble a lot more space to work with, because just the way sound works with the overtones, it can build up very easily and very quickly when you put a lot of low-end instruments together. It kind of muddies up the sound very, very quickly. So to combat this, we start with wide intervals at the bottom, space those notes out appropriately, and then as you move upwards, those offending frequencies become less and less, so you can have smaller intervals to create those harmonies and so on and so forth. And yeah, small lower intervals tend to clog up the frequency spectrum very easily because of the way sound works. So arranging in octaves or larger, like we said, 12s or 15s, then moving down to parallel intervals like fifths, and then thirds and fourths, and other intervals like seconds and sixths, which have a bit more color and a bit more dissonance. Those will ensure that the spectrum remains balanced and easy to listen to. So for example, if we have an F major chord we're trying to create, then probably at the very bottom you're going to have an octave F to F, and then maybe you have a fifth, so you have a C, then you want to put the third a little bit higher because it's a very colorful note. Then you have all four notes. You have F, F, C, and A, and you get this beautiful spread sound that doesn't sound like it's muddy because you spaced out those notes appropriately. And I would say it works well for all the orchestral sections, so from strings all the way to the brass, and for most combinations like doublings as well. So a great template to kind of keep in mind, the harmonic series. Each instrument will contain its own overtones and partials whose volumes create its characteristic timbre. So for example, a clarinet versus a trumpet, they sound different because even though they're playing the same note, the volume balances between the overtones and the partials differ, which create its unique kind of characteristic sound. All right, the second approach is to think melodically. So here we're talking about thinking in a horizontal line from start to finish, where whether it's a one-bar phrase or an entire passage that you're trying to write out, thinking melodically is a very great approach. So a lot of amateur arrangers think about orchestration from a pianistic perspective, and as pianists, we're playing a percussion instrument, right? So we're playing chords, we're playing more frilly textures or whatever, but at the end of the day, playing chords and playing downwards creates this kind of vertical approach in our minds, whereas when we're trying to arrange for the orchestra, I prefer to think of things from a more horizontal perspective, from a more melodic perspective. So when we play blocked chords repeatedly, this can cause a static sound, right, instead of a flowing and moving sound. And things like voice leading and counterpoint, those are all as a result of good, smooth melodies rather than thinking in blocked terms. So as a general rule of thumb, I like to recommend writing the lines or writing lines down that would be interesting for the musician to perform. Most musicians will prefer to play a nice melody, a nice line, rather than just the same repeated note over and over, right? It's a little bit boring. So think from the perspective of a performer. I mean, you are a musician yourself, so it makes sense to write something that another musician would also enjoy. And this is how beautiful counter melodies and response lines are formed, right? All the while considering the rest of the arrangement and ensuring all the parts work harmonically well together. So if I'm writing a main melody and then I'm writing a counter melody, well, I want to make sure that counter melody fits harmonically with what chords are being played in the melody. So if it's like an F major chord, maybe the melody is playing an F, well, my counter melody could also play an F, but maybe it wants to start on an A or a C instead. And that would work because, again, we're on an F major chord, and F, A, and C are all within that F major chord. And then the third technique is arranging in layers. So again, thinking from that perspective of most important to least important, or maybe better to think of it as the most prominent aspect and then the more decorative aspects last. So rather than writing out every single instrument that comes to mind right away in your DAW, I would always prefer to prioritize your instruments. So if a piece contains like a beautiful melody, then what instruments should be used to perform that melody and present its quality, right? You want to make sure that's protruded, or you want to make sure it's shown out very prominently because, again, that's the melody. You want it to be heard, whereas the other aspects are going to be less important. So thinking with that perspective is very useful. And then on the other hand, if the chord progression or the groove is fundamental, then maybe starting with those instruments instead would set a good base for the melody later. So you don't always have to start with the melody, but just knowing that there are different approaches that you can take gives you a lot of flexibility when you are orchestrating your piece of music. So as a general rule of thumb, again, I like to start arranging the most important elements first, then move on to the rest, basically just to move in order of the most to the least important, because I reserve like ear candy and details for last. I prefer to get the fundamental foundational instruments down first to really lay down those most important elements, and then move on to the harmonic textures or those ear candy elements that add that polish and that spice, but are not necessarily as essential as those foundational elements. So let me really quickly show you an example using a piece called Love's Rapture, and I'll go through these techniques with you. All right, so here we are in Love's Rapture. This is a kind of a ballad flowing piece with strings and winds and brass. But I just want to show you the climax part where the main theme is really being sung by the melody in the violins. And let me just break down each step once at a time with you. So have a quick listen. Cool. Okay, let's stop there. So what I was basically going for was a very clear melody and a very expansive orchestration and harmonic foundation at the very bottom that allows that melody to be heard without any clogged frequencies. So let's take a quick look at this MIDI actually. First of all, the first rule we talked about was the harmonic series and ensuring that the different instruments were spread out evenly. So if we go back to the main section here, let's see, where was it? Right here. So you see this top line here, the violins one are playing this melody, and we get the violins two kind of supporting right underneath. So this is something I tend to like to do. I like to use my violins one to outline the melody in most cases, and then I'll use the violins two again to kind of outline that foundation underneath to provide that harmony, or maybe play some counter melodies right underneath. Then underneath that, we have the viola part. And this has quite a variety of applications actually. You can use it to fill in the gaps between the violins and the cellos and the basses. You can have it more specifically kind of counter the violins too, like play around with them, play counter melodies with those, or do that with the cellos as well. So maybe I'll solo up the MIDI one at a time here. So here's the violins one, this is the melody. Then the violins two, violins 2 added in. You can see it's kind of right below. Usually the interval is about a fourth, a fifth below. So there's quite a bit of space there because I want that melody to be individual and I want it to be heard, right? Then you can see the viola is a little more active here. There's more There's more step ups here. There's more movement when the other notes are being held, which is something I kind of went for. Then we move on to the cellos. And you can see, again, here's some motion, some counter melody, and kind of moving up with the violas at the same time as well here. And then the double basses are here at the bottom. Now, just notice that they are kind of smushed in with the cellos, and that's just because this is Cinematic Studio strings, so they're actually sounding one octave lower than written. So these notes here, they are the double basses, but because they sound an octave lower than written, I had to write them up a little bit higher. But anyway, let's just have one more listen to that. And what I'll do is maybe I'll solo up the parts as well. So this is what violins 1, or actually that's the MIDI tracks. I have to go down here to the audio. So let's kind of start with the violins 1. At the violins 2. Hear that harmony there, right? And then the violas. Counter melody there in the violas. Cellos. You can hear it's like about an octave lower or so than the cello. Right, so let's maybe hear that just one more time. So overall, I mean, all the string parts are taking up maybe, what, 4, 5 octaves? And when you only have 5 parts, it's great because then you can really take advantage of each of those parts and make sure that they're filling up one specific octave or register. So here you see some contrary motion with the double basses and the violas there. Sorry, with the cello and the violas, I should say. So the double basses are basically just outlining the chords, the harmonic foundation there. And then they play more harmonic role here because the woodwinds now have the melody. Violins 1 and 2 kind of soaring up together. Anyway, you get the point. So that I think that was step number 1. Step number 2 was thinking melodically, right? So thinking in a more horizontal line. Well, naturally, because this is the main melody in the violins 1, I'm going to be thinking melodically, right? So you can see da 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 da. So there's kind of a natural contour here with the melody, and I really wanted to match that with the violins 2. So you can see it kind of looks similar to violins 1. It's just outlining, but again, I kind of played it in separately. I played it in live, riding the mod wheel, and I got a more melodic approach that way. So violins 1 and 2 are quite interlaced together here. Then the violas and the cello, respectively, you can see how they're quite melodic as well, right? So we just have a quick listen to those, maybe on their own. Here we go. Right, you hear how they're not really jumping around a lot. Like there's more stepwise motion, there's the occasional skip, but they're kind of feeding off of each other. Right, a lot of thirds and sixths there, which provide a lot of color in the classical tradition. So that's kind of step number 2, is just to think melodically and try to write lines that you think the instrumentalist would enjoy, you know? Really important. Here's an example of the Tina Guo cello, like there's some rise, there's some fall, rather than just having repeated notes over and over, or just holding the same note for an extended period of time. That would not be very fun to play, you know? So yeah, you want to write engaging parts for your players. Even if it's a virtual instrument, it'll still sound more natural and it flows nicely if you have those melodic style lines. And then the third and final point was to think in terms of layers, right? So in this case, we have the violins 1, being the main melody, then we have the violins 2 kind of supporting. The other strings are kind of enhancing the overall arrangement as well. And then after I nailed down the string arrangement, I actually started with the string arrangement, right? So if I just solo the strings up here, this is what I arranged first. I tried to achieve all my chord tones. I wanted to fill in the gaps as much as possible with my 5-string parts. And then I pulled in some extra patches just to, fill in the textures a little bit. But then after that is when I added the woodwinds, because I wanted a little more color overall. Play some counter melody, same idea with the brass. The tuba's kind of doubling the double basses there. And of course the percussion is outlining some of those harmonic moments, the timpani, and then giving the cymbal a chance to crash when we get to those emphatic moments. Right, so you can very clearly hear that melody on top in the strings, the violins, whereas everything else is kind of supporting it underneath. And then we've added everything else. So you get the piano filling in that mid-range as well. There's also some choir here as well. Yeah, and that's basically it. So these are three of the most important orchestration techniques in my opinion, because it will allow you to fundamentally think about the orchestra in a slightly different way, in a more melodic, in a more musical way. And every time I'm writing an arrangement like this, I'm always trying to think from the perspective of the performers. Like, what would they enjoy? How could I get the best out of their performances? And that simply is to give them something interesting and something inspiring to play. So if you follow these three rules, I think you'll have a really good foundation in your mockups and your orchestrations. All right, so let's really quickly recap the three orchestration techniques. Number one is to use the harmonic series, which helps us create full and resonant chords. Again, wider intervals at the bottom, and then you can go narrower at the top. Number two is to think melodically, so creating enjoyable parts to play while making it sound natural and seamless. And finally, arranging in layers, which allows for a very balanced orchestration with clarity in all the instruments. And when I say clarity, I just mean knowing exactly what each instrument part is doing, what each section's role is, so that you can place the emphasis on certain instruments and sections over others. Okay, hopefully that all makes sense. And these approaches will really help you think about arranging in, a more musical way and really speed up your workflow at the same time as you put this into practice and do this more and more. So again, before you go, make sure you download the Orchestration Essentials Guide if you want to take this learning even further. Again, this goes over my 5-step framework to approaching every single arrangement that I do, whether it's for a live ensemble or for a mockup. And again, we'll go over how to start from a general perspective and work our way into the details, specific orchestration techniques that we can apply right away to our mockups, and also my favorite elements for ear candy and added interest, really enhancing the listening experience and adding that final polish to the arrangement. Okay, thank you so much again. I really appreciate it. Again, you can grab that in the description box below. It's the first link there. And again, it's my gift to you for checking out this video. I hope you enjoy it. And again, thank you for checking out the video. I'll see you in the next one. Take care and have fun making music. Bye-bye.